Hey guys, welcome back. I'm so glad you could join me tonight. We're about to venture into one of the most remarkable, and to our modern minds, one of the most utterly bizarre chapters of human history, the sprawling, chaotic, and incredibly lucrative trade in holy relics. It was an industry built on faith, fueled by fear, and constructed, quite literally, from the dust and bones of the long dead. We're going to explore the incredible resilience and, frankly, the sheer creative ingenuity people employed to feel a little safer in a world that felt anything but. It's a story about the profound human need for connection, for something tangible to hold on to when everything else feels uncertain. Before we begin our journey, if you enjoy what I do here, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It's a small thing, but it helps so much. And please, only if you genuinely enjoy this quiet little corner of the internet we've built together. In the comments, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. It's always so humbling to see this community of quiet listeners spread out all across the world, all settling in for the night together. Now, let's get comfortable. Dim the lights, if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull the covers up, and let your head sink into the pillow. Let the day's worries just dissolve. There's nothing you need to do now, nowhere you need to be. Just rest. Let your breathing slow down, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. Foundations of Faith. The genesis of the relic cult. To understand the medieval world's obsession with relics, the finger bones of saints, vials of the Virgin Mary's milk, splinters from the true cross, we can't just jump into the bustling marketplace where these things were bought and sold. That would be like starting a movie in the final act. No, we have to go back to a time before this was an industry at all, back to the very beginning, to the blood and sand of the Roman Empire, where the seeds of this incredible phenomenon were first planted, not in a desire for profit, but in love, grief, and defiance. Imagine for a moment, you are an early Christian in, say, the 2nd or 3rd century. Your faith isn't the dominant state-sponsored religion of cathedrals and kings that it would one day become. Far from it. It's a fringe belief system, viewed with deep suspicion by the Roman authorities. It's a religion of quiet meetings in people's homes, of shared meals, of whispered prayers. It's a community bound together by a radical new idea, but also by the constant looming threat of persecution. And then, the worst happens. A member of your community, someone you know, perhaps your teacher, your friend, a respected elder named Polycarp or Agnes, is arrested. They are accused of atheism, which is what the Romans called the refusal to worship their gods and the emperor. They are dragged before a magistrate and given a simple choice: offer a pinch of incense to the emperor's statue, a small gesture of loyalty, or face the consequences. Your friend refuses. They hold fast to their faith, and for this they are condemned. The sentence is carried out publicly, in the arena. It's a brutal, terrifying spectacle designed to intimidate, to show the power of the state and the futility of resistance. But as your community watches, hidden amongst the jeering crowds, you see something else. You don't just see a victim, you see a hero. You see someone so convicted in their belief, so certain of the promise of an afterlife, that they can face down the full might of the Roman Empire and not break. In Greek, the word for witness is martyrs, and in this moment, your friend becomes a martyr, a witness to their faith in the most absolute way possible. When it's all over, when the crowds have dispersed and the arena is quiet, your little community does something profoundly human. You creep back to that place of horror, and you gather what you can. The Roman authorities would often try to burn the bodies of martyrs to prevent this very thing from happening. They understood, on some level, that the physical remains of these figures held a certain power, but the Christians were persistent. They would bribe guards, or wait until the dead of night. They would collect the charred bones, the ashes. They might even find a scrap of blood-soaked cloth. Now, it's crucial to understand what they were doing in this moment, and perhaps more importantly, what they weren't doing. They weren't collecting magical talismans. They weren't thinking, this piece of bone will cure my sick child. Not yet. The impulse was much simpler, much more relatable. It was about memory. It was about honor. In a world with no photographs, no video tributes, these physical remnants were the most powerful memorials imaginable. It was the same human instinct, that might lead someone today to keep a locket of a loved one's hair or a favorite worn-out sweater. It's a way of keeping a piece of them with you. They would take these precious remains and give them a proper, respectful burial. The tomb of a martyr became a sacred place, but it wasn't a place of mourning in the way we might think. It was called a trapion, a trophy, a monument to a victory. The martyr hadn't been defeated by Rome, they had triumphed over death itself, and so on the anniversary of their death, what they called their dies natalis, their heavenly birthday, the community would gather at the tomb, they would share a meal, tell stories of the martyr's life and courage, and pray. They prayed at the tomb, not to the tomb. The distinction is subtle, but it was everything. They believed that this place, this physical link to their fallen hero, was a particularly good spot to have a word with God. The martyr was in heaven now, standing in God's presence. Surely, praying near their earthly remains made your own prayers feel a little closer, a little more likely to be heard. For the first few centuries, this was largely how it stayed, a private, community-focused veneration of local heroes. There was no widespread trade, no grand basilicas built to house a single tooth. It was intimate, personal, and rooted in the lived experience of persecution. But then, in the 4th century, everything changed. A Roman emperor named Constantine had a vision, won a battle, and converted to Christianity. Suddenly, this small, persecuted sect was the favoured religion of the most powerful empire in the world. The age of martyrs was, for the most part, over. Christians were no longer hiding in catacombs. They were building magnificent churches out in the open. And this presented a new and interesting question. A church is just a building, a collection of stone and wood and mortar. How do you make it holy? How do you infuse this man-made structure with the presence of the divine? The answer, they decided, was already there, in the tombs of the martyrs. The tradition began of building these new grand churches directly on top of the graves of these early saints. The altar, the most sacred spot in the entire church where the Eucharist was celebrated, would be positioned directly above the bones of the martyr. The tomb became the foundation stone. Every single service, every prayer, was now physically and symbolically grounded in the sacrifice of those who had come before. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, for example, was constructed over what was believed to be the final resting place of the Apostle Peter himself. The church wasn't just a building in Rome, its holiness was believed to emanate directly from the bones of the first pope. This was a pivotal moment. The relic was no longer just a memorial for a small community, it was now the spiritual engine of the church, the essential component for making a space sacred, and this created the first real problem of supply and demand. It was wonderful if you happened to live in Rome or Antioch, cities with a rich history of famous martyrs buried right under your feet. But what if you were a new Christian community in a small town in Gaul, or a remote village in Britain? You've just built your first little wooden church. You're immensely proud of it, but to make it official, to consecrate the altar, you needed a relic, a proper one. Where were you supposed to get it? This is where the idea of the relic begins to detach from its original location. If you couldn't build your church on top of a saint, the thinking went, maybe you could bring a piece of the saint to your church. The body of a saint, once considered indivisible and to be respected in its tomb, slowly began to be seen differently. If the entire body was holy, then surely every part of the body was holy. A finger, a rib, a lock of hair, each piece was believed to contain the full spiritual power, the virtus of the whole saint. This concept of virtus is key. It's a Latin word that means power, virtue or strength. Theologians began to argue that because the saint's body had been a temple for the Holy Spirit during their life, a divine energy, a sort of holy radiation, lingered in their physical remains even after death. It wasn't magic, they insisted. It was a kind of divine physics. God had supercharged this person's soul, and their body acted like a battery, holding that charge. To come into contact with the relic, or even to be near it, was to expose yourself to that residual divine energy. And this is where the stories of miracles begin to multiply. Early on, the miracles were often small, personal things. Someone with a fever would pray at the tomb of St. Martin of Tours, and their fever would break. A farmer whose cow had gone missing would make a vow to St. Giles, and the cow would wander back into the pasture. These stories would spread from one village to the next, carried by travellers and pilgrims, and with each telling, The reputation of the saint and the power of their relics grew. The relic was transforming. It was no longer just a memorial of the past, or a tool for consecrating a church. It was becoming an active agent in the present. It was a source of healing, a form of protection, a tangible link to a powerful friend in the heavenly court. Think of it from the perspective of an ordinary person in, say, the 6th or 7th century. Your life is precarious. You are a peasant farmer, and your entire existence depends on the whims of the weather. A drought could mean starvation. An early frost could wipe out your crops. Disease is a constant threat, with no understanding of germs or modern medicine. A simple infection from a cut could be a death sentence. Your children are fragile. Many don't survive past their first few years. Beyond the hardships of this life, you are taught of the eternal terrors of the next, the fires of hell, the judgment of an all-powerful God. God, in this worldview, can feel immensely distant. He is the Emperor of Heaven, a majestic and intimidating figure. Jesus, though more approachable, is still the Son of God, a divine judge. The prayers in church are in Latin, a language you don't understand. The whole system of official religion can feel abstract and far away. But a saint is different. Saints were once people. They lived on this earth. They knew hardship. They knew suffering. They knew fear. Saint Stephen was a deacon. Saint Crispin was a shoemaker. Saint Apollonia was a dentist's worst nightmare, and is now their patron. They were relatable. They were specialists. You wouldn't bother the Emperor of Heaven with a toothache, but you could absolutely ask Saint Apollonia for a little help. The saints were your advocates, your lobbyists in the celestial bureaucracy. They were friends in very, very high places, who could put in a good word for you with the big boss. And the relic was their calling card. It was the physical proof that the saint was present, right here, in your little church, in your village. It wasn't an abstract idea. It was a piece of bone in a beautiful golden box that you could see with your own eyes. On feast days, maybe you could even get close enough to touch the container. In a world of terrifying uncertainty, the relic was an anchor. It was a physical, tangible, undeniable connection to divine power. It made hope feel real. Of course, not everyone was entirely comfortable with this evolving practice. From the very beginning, there were critics. Opponents, often non-Christians, looked at this and saw something that looked suspiciously like their own pagan practices. They would say, "You're making fun of us for worshipping idols of Jupiter and Apollo, but you're down there worshipping a dead man's shin bone. What's the difference?" It was a potent accusation, and it hit a nerve. Was this veneration of saints and their remains simply a rebranded form of polytheism and idol worship? This is when the great intellectuals of the church fathers, stepped in to provide the theological heavy lifting. They became the official legal and PR department for the burgeoning cult of relics. Figures like Saint Jerome and Saint Augustine of Hippo took on the critics directly. Saint Jerome, a famously cantankerous but brilliant scholar, was having none of the accusations of idolatry. He drew a very fine but absolutely critical distinction. He argued with considerable rhetorical fire that Christians do not worship the relics. Worship, he said, is reserved for God alone. That is latria. Instead, they venerate the relics. They show them honor and respect. That is dulia. "We do not worship, I repeat," he wrote. "We do not adore, for fear that we should bow down to the creature rather than to the Creator. But we venerate the relics of the martyrs in order to adore him whose martyrs they are." It's a beautiful piece of theological footwork. Think of it this way. You might admire a magnificent work of art, a beautiful sculpture, or a breathtaking painting. But in admiring the art, you are ultimately giving honor to the artist who created it. For Jerome, the saint was God's masterpiece. To venerate the relic, the physical remnant of that masterpiece, was simply a way of honoring the divine artist, God himself. It wasn't worshipping the bone. It was using the bone as a way to direct your worship to God. Saint Augustine, one of the most influential thinkers in all of Western history, had a slightly different but complementary take. He was, by nature, a more skeptical and philosophical man. Initially, he seems to have been a bit wary of the more flamboyant miracle stories and the intense popular enthusiasm for relics, but he couldn't deny the effect they had. He saw firsthand how these relics brought people to the faith, how they strengthened communities, how they seemed to provide genuine comfort, and, in some documented cases, result in inexplicable healings. He tells a famous story in his work, The City of God, about the discovery of the relics of Saint Stephen in Jerusalem. When these relics were brought to his home region in North Africa, a whole series of public miracles were reported. A blind woman regained her sight. A man was cured of gout. Augustine records these events with the careful eye of a journalist. For him, these weren't just folk tales. They were proof. They were evidence that God was still actively working in the world. Long after the age of the apostles, the miracles authenticated the relics, and the relics in turn served as a constant public reminder of God's power and mercy. They were a form of ongoing revelation, a divine shout-out to the faithful. So by the time we exit late antiquity and enter the early Middle Ages, all the foundational pieces are in place. You have the deep psychological need, born from a dangerous and uncertain world, for a tangible connection to the divine, for a feeling of safety and protection. You have the theological framework, carefully constructed by the greatest minds of the Church, that justifies the veneration of these objects and distinguishes it from pagan idolatry. The saints are intercessors, powerful friends in heaven. You have the belief in virtus, the inherent miraculous power contained within the physical remains, a power that can heal the sick and protect the community. And most importantly, you have the practical, liturgical necessity. Thanks to the tradition of consecrating altars, a relic is no longer a spiritual luxury item. It has become a non-negotiable piece of spiritual infrastructure. Every church, every monastery, every cathedral, from the grandest in Rome to the humblest chapel in the forests of Germany, had to have one. It was the law of the Church. The Second Council of Nicaea, in 787 AD, made it official canon law. No altar could be consecrated without a holy relic. A vast continent-wide demand had been created, a demand for something that was, by its very nature, in extremely limited supply. The original martyrs were long dead, their bodies either lost to time or already accounted for in the great churches of the old Roman world. And yet, new churches were being built every day. The stage was now perfectly set. You have a desperate, fearful populace, a supportive theological establishment, and an insatiable institutional demand for a finite resource. It doesn't take an economic genius to figure out what happens next. A market is born, a strange and wonderful, and often deeply corrupt market. The quest for relics was about to begin in earnest, and people would soon be willing to do almost anything, to pay any price, to travel any distance, and to commit any crime to get their hands on a piece of the holy. The quiet personal act of gathering the ashes of a friend in a Roman arena had over centuries evolved into the foundation for a spiritual gold rush that would define the next 1,000 years of European history. And that is where our story will lead us next, into the wild, booming, and often bizarre world of the medieval relic trade. Chapter 2. The Holy Supply Chain, Acquisition, Theft, and Forgery. So, you have a spiritual gold rush, an entire continent, from the humblest farmer to the most powerful king, suddenly convinced that their salvation, their health, and their fortune depend on possessing a physical fragment of holiness. The demand is, for all intents and purposes, infinite. But the supply, well, the supply is decidedly finite. The saints, after all, had stopped making new saints some time ago, at least the big, famous marquee names from the Gospels and the early days of the Church. You can't just commission a new femur from St. Peter. You can't put in a back order for a vial of milk from the Virgin Mary. The original apostles only had one head each, a detail that would become surprisingly flexible over time. But in principle, the raw materials were limited, and whenever you have infinite demand crashing against a wall of finite supply, you get a market, a wild, unregulated, and frankly deeply strange market. This wasn't a market of stocks or grain. It was a market of grace, a commodities exchange for miracles, and like any market, it required a supply chain. It needed methods for acquisition, distribution networks, and a system, however flimsy, for verifying the product. The story of the relic trade isn't just about faith, it's about the incredible, often morally ambiguous, and sometimes downright criminal ingenuity that went into getting a piece of a long-dead saint from their forgotten tomb in Rome or the Holy Land, and into a brand new gilded cathedral in the rainy north of France. The system that evolved was a complex beast with three main branches, ranging from the officially sanctioned to the creatively criminal. Let's call them the three main ways to stock your spiritual shelves. You could have the relic officially moved, you could miraculously find one, or you could steal it. The first and most respectable method was what the church called a translation. It's a lovely, gentle word, isn't it? Translation. It sounds like you're simply moving a file from one folder to another on a computer. It evokes a sense of smooth, effortless transfer. In reality, it was the medieval equivalent of a state visit, wrapped in a funeral procession, wrapped in a festival. A translation was the officially sanctioned, fully authorized, paperwork in triplicate moving of a saint's remains from one location to another. Imagine a small town in Italy has been the quiet custodian of, say, the body of Saint Agnes for centuries, but now a powerful German emperor has built a magnificent new cathedral in Aachen, and he wants a headliner. A local minor saint just won't do for his grand imperial project. He needs a celebrity, so he sends envoys to the Pope. Negotiations happen. Donations are made to the right clerical coffers. The argument is put forth that Saint Agnes would be able to do so much more good. Her story could inspire so many more people from a grand imperial stage rather than her sleepy little Italian town. It's a spiritual promotion. And if the Pope agrees, the process begins. A delegation of high-ranking clergy, probably accompanied by armed knights to ensure the safety of the relic, would travel to the town. The tomb would be opened with immense ceremony. We're talking choirs, incense so thick you could barely see, and the ringing of every church bell for miles. The bones, or what was left of them, would be carefully exhumed, wrapped in the finest silks, and placed into a specially made container, a temporary reliquary. Then, the long journey home would begin. This wasn't a quiet trip in the back of a cart. This was a parade that could last for weeks or months. As the procession moved from town to town, people would flock from the countryside to see it. The sick and the lame would be brought to the roadside, hoping for a miracle as the saint passed by. Each stop was an event. The local lord would host the delegation. The local bishop would hold a special mass. It was a rolling wave of holiness and spectacle. When the relic finally arrived at its new home, the celebration was even grander. The emperor, the archbishops, the nobles, everyone was there. The saint was officially welcomed into their new cathedral. A sermon was preached on the great honor and responsibility of hosting such a treasure, and the relic was installed in its magnificent new shrine, probably right behind the main altar. The cathedral's prestige and its pilgrim traffic would skyrocket overnight. It was now a premier destination. It had, in modern terms, landed a major tourist attraction. This was the clean, official, above-board method. It had pomp, it had circumstance, and it had papal blessing. It was the least interesting of the three methods, but it was the bedrock of the whole system. It established the principle that saints could and should be moved for the greater glory of God, and, not coincidentally, for the greater glory of their new owners. But what if you didn't have the political clout or the deep pockets to persuade the Pope to grant you a translation? What if your little monastery in the damp hills of England desperately needed a spiritual shot in the arm, but you had no claim on any known saint? Well, then you might be blessed with the second method of acquisition, the invention. The Latin word is inventio, and it means a finding. It's the root of our word inventory, but it's much closer in spirit to invention. This was the miraculous discovery of a previously unknown or long-lost saint's tomb, and these discoveries happened with a remarkable, and often remarkably convenient frequency. The process usually followed a very specific script. It would begin with a humble and pious individual, often a monk, a local priest, or sometimes even a simple peasant. This person would start having dreams. In these dreams, a luminous figure, often the saint themselves, would appear. The saint would explain that their body had been lying forgotten for centuries in a particular spot, maybe in an overgrown corner of the church graveyard, under the floorboards of the old chapel, or out in a farmer's field. The saint would gently complain that they were being neglected, and would instruct the dreamer to tell the bishop and to dig in that very spot. At first, of course, the dreamer would be filled with doubt. Who am I, a simple person, to have received such a holy vision? They would try to ignore it, but the dream would come back, night after night, more insistent each time. The saint might even get a little bit cross. Finally, overwhelmed by the divine pressure, the dreamer would confess their visions to the local priest or abbot. The cleric, after a period of suitable skepticism and prayerful consideration, would become convinced of the dream's authenticity. The whole thing had a wonderful air of plausible deniability. It wasn't the church actively looking for a relic. Heaven itself had intervened. So a day would be set, the bishop would arrive, and a solemn procession would make its way to the spot indicated in the dream. The villagers would gather, murmuring with a mixture of excitement and piety. Then the digging would commence. The tension would mount with each shovel of earth. And then, a cry. The shovel would strike something hard. Not a rock, but stone. Carefully the dirt would be brushed away to reveal the lid of an ancient, forgotten sarcophagus, or perhaps just a simple wooden box, miraculously preserved. The moment of truth would arrive. The tomb is opened, and inside, bones, but not just any bones. Very often, a sweet, unearthly perfume. The fabled odour of sanctity, said to smell like roses or lilies, would fill the air, a sure sign of holiness. The bones themselves might be unnaturally white and clean. Sometimes an inscription would be found, conveniently identifying the saint by name. The bishop would declare it a miracle, a gift from God. The newfound saint would be given a name, often a local or obscure one, and their story would be quickly written, or perhaps rediscovered in a dusty manuscript. The bones would be reverently collected and placed in a new shrine, and a new saint's cult would be born overnight. It was, you have to admit, a perfect system. It provided a steady stream of new relics, especially for more remote or less wealthy churches that couldn't compete in the high-stakes international market. It gave local communities their own special protector, a hometown saint they could be proud of, and it was all but impossible to disprove. Who could argue with a man's dream? Who could question a miracle authenticated by the sweet smell of sanctity and the word of a bishop? To do so would be to question God's mysterious ways. It was a process built on a foundation of genuine faith, wishful thinking, and what we might politely call a high degree of narrative flexibility. The line between a genuine, deeply felt spiritual experience and a pious, well-intentioned fraud was, in the medieval mind, often very blurry indeed. If finding a saint brought more people to the church and saved more souls, was it really a lie, or was it just helping a miracle along? These first two methods, translation and invention, were the respectable face of the relic trade. They were the corporate-approved channels, the official dealerships, but the real engine of the market, the one that drove the most dramatic stories and moved some of the most famous relics across the map of Europe, was the third method. This was the grey market, the back-alley deal, the method that operated under a flimsy veil of theological justification, but which, to our modern eyes, looks an awful lot like straightforward grand larceny. This was the practice known as furta sacra, holy theft. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? Like peaceful invasion or honest politician. Yet for several centuries, it was one of the most common, and in a strange way accepted methods of acquiring a top-tier relic. The logic behind it was a masterpiece of medieval mental gymnastics, and it went something like this. A truly powerful saint is not a passive object. They are an active agent, a powerful lord in the court of heaven, with opinions and preferences. If a saint was unhappy with their current location, if their church was dilapidated, if their custodians were not showing them proper respect, or if they simply felt they could accomplish more elsewhere, they might arrange for their own relocation. And how would a saint arrange such a thing? They wouldn't pack their own bones and walk. Instead, they would signal their desire to move by allowing themselves to be stolen. The thieves, in this framework, weren't criminals. Oh no. They were agents of the divine will, chosen instruments of the saint's own wishes. They were a wholly moving company. The proof of the saint's consent was in the success of the heist. The thieves would pray to the saint for guidance before the act. If they managed to get into the crypt undetected, if the locks miraculously sprang open, if the guards were mysteriously asleep, this was a sign that the saint was helping them. If they managed to escape with the body and make it back to their home city, and if the saint then began to perform miracles in their new location, that was the ultimate confirmation. The saint had voted with their feet, or rather with their femurs. The original owners, who had just lost their most precious treasure, could complain all they wanted. The theological argument was airtight. If the saint had wanted to stay, they would have simply struck the thieves down with lightning, or paralyzed them on the spot. The fact that they didn't was tacit approval. They were happier in their new home. Case closed. This extraordinary justification opened the floodgates for some of the most audacious heists in history, turning pious monks and merchants into holy cat burglars. And there is no greater example of furta sacra, no story that better captures the blend of civic pride, commercial ambition and crooked piety than the story of how Saint Mark the Evangelist ended up in Venice. Let's set the scene. It's the early 9th century, the year 828. The city of Venice is a strange and ambitious place, a city built on mudflats and salt marshes, a rising maritime power that feels like a startup company. It's scrappy, it's hungry, and it's suffering from a bit of an inferiority complex. It's surrounded by older, more established powers like Rome and the Byzantine Empire, and every great city had a great patron saint, preferably an apostle or someone with a direct connection to Christ. Rome had Peter and Paul, Constantinople had Andrew. Venice had Saint Theodore, a respectable but ultimately second-string Byzantine soldier saint. He was perfectly fine, but he didn't have the brand recognition, the international clout that the Venetians craved. They needed an upgrade. They needed a spiritual superstar to be their patron, to protect their ships, and to announce their arrival on the world stage. Their gaze fell upon Alexandria, in Egypt. Alexandria was one of the great ancient centers of Christianity, but by the 9th century it was under Muslim rule, and according to a very strong tradition, Alexandria held the body of one of the 4 evangelists, the author of a gospel himself, Saint Mark. For the Venetians, it was a perfect opportunity. Mark was an A-list saint, and his current custodians were, from the Venetian perspective, infidels who couldn't possibly be caring for him properly. A rescue mission was in order, a holy theft. The official story, as recorded by the Venetians themselves of course, goes like this. 2 Venetian merchants whose wonderful names were Buono and Rustico, good and rustic, were trading in Alexandria. They heard a rumour that the local caliph was planning to demolish the church where Saint Mark was buried in order to use its marble and columns to build a new palace. The local Christian priests were in despair. Seizing their chance, Buono and Rustico approached the priests and made their offer. "Let us save the saint's body," they said. "Let us take him to a new, safe Christian home in Venice, where a magnificent church will be built in his honour. He will be venerated as he deserves." The priests, seeing little other choice, tearfully agreed. The heist was on. The first problem was getting into the tomb. The body of Saint Mark was apparently sealed up, and the Venetian merchants had to carefully unseal the wrappings. Here the story takes a turn. To avoid suspicion, they couldn't just leave an empty tomb, so in a rather pragmatic move, they swapped the body of Saint Mark with the nearby body of a lesser saint, Saint Claudia, rewrapped her, and hoped no one would notice the difference for a while. The next and bigger problem was smuggling an entire human body out of the city and past the Muslim customs officials at the port. This is where the plan becomes truly ingenious and a little bit profane. Buono and Rustico placed the body of the evangelist in a large wicker basket and then covered him completely with cuts of pork. They knew that the Muslim guards, for whom pork is strictly forbidden, would be disgusted by the sight and smell of the meat. They wouldn't dare to inspect the basket too closely. They were counting on religious aversion as their cloak of invisibility, and it worked perfectly. As they carried the basket towards their ship, the customs officials stopped them and asked what they had. "Pork," the merchants declared, lifting the lid to release the offending aroma. The guards recoiled in horror, shouting "Khanzir, Khanzir, pig, pig," and waved them through immediately, wanting nothing more to do with the unclean cargo. It's a wonderfully absurd image, the author of one of the Gospels being smuggled out of Egypt under a pile of bacon to avoid a customs inspection. They got the body onto their ship and set sail for Venice. But the story doesn't end there. According to the legend, a terrible storm blew up during the voyage, threatening to sink the ship. The sailors were in a panic. But just as all hope seemed lost, Saint Mark himself appeared to the captain, woke him up, and told him to lower the sails immediately. The captain obeyed, and the ship was saved from the worst of the gale. This was the crucial final piece of the puzzle. It was the saint's own post facto endorsement of the theft. He had actively intervened to protect his own getaway vehicle. Clearly he was thrilled to be heading to Venice. When the ship finally arrived in the Venetian lagoon, the entire city erupted in celebration. The Doge, the political leader of Venice, came out to meet the ship, The body was brought ashore in a grand procession and was eventually housed in a temporary chapel. The Venetians immediately began construction on a new, spectacular church to be his shrine, the first version of St. Mark's Basilica. From that day forward, Venice had its man, the winged lion. The symbol of St. Mark became the symbol of Venice itself, emblazoned on its flags and its buildings. The city's identity was now fused with its new patron. They hadn't just acquired a relic, they had acquired a national identity, a divine protector, and a powerful symbol of their ambition. The theft of St. Mark wasn't just a holy act, it was the most successful act of state-sponsored branding in medieval history, and it was all justified by the simple, elegant, and entirely self-serving logic of furta sacra. For a few centuries, these three methods, official translation, miraculous invention, and holy theft, formed the basis of the relic supply chain. It was a thriving, if sometimes chaotic, system, but in the year 1204, an event occurred that would shatter the existing market and flood Western Europe with a torrent of relics, so vast it would be like discovering a new continent made of gold. That event was the Fourth Crusade and its catastrophic sack of the city of Constantinople. To understand the impact of this, you have to understand what Constantinople was. For nearly 1,000 years, it had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. It was the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city in Christendom, and for centuries, while Western Europe was struggling through the so-called Dark Ages, Constantinople had been the world's foremost collector of holy relics. Its emperors and patriarchs had used their immense wealth and influence to gather the most precious relics from all over the Holy Land and the East. The city was, quite literally, a vault. It had a collection that no city in the West could even dream of. They had, it was claimed, the crown of thorns, the spear that pierced Christ's side, a large portion of the true cross, the swaddling clothes of the infant Jesus, and the heads of countless apostles and major saints. Their churches weren't just places of worship, they were museums of the divine. The Fourth Crusade was never supposed to go to Constantinople. It was supposed to go to Egypt to fight the Saracens. But through a complex and still debated series of political mishaps, debts, and Venetian ambition, the massive Crusader army was diverted. They ended up camped outside the walls of their fellow Christians in Constantinople. Tensions flared, a succession crisis within the city boiled over, and the unthinkable happened. In April of 1204, the Crusader army breached the walls and poured into the city. What followed was one of the most brutal and infamous sacks of a city in history. For 3 days, the Crusaders, men who had taken a vow to protect Christendom, ran riot, looting, destroying and desecrating the greatest Christian city on earth. They spared nothing. They melted down ancient bronze statues for coin, they smashed priceless mosaics, and they ransacked the palaces and homes of the city's elite. But their primary target, their ultimate prize, was the city's unparalleled collection of relics. The stories from the chronicles are shocking. Knights and common soldiers who could barely read and had little theological training burst into the great churches of the city, Hagia Sophia, the Pharos Chapel, and began to tear them apart. They didn't know the stories behind half of what they were taking. They just knew it was holy, and it was valuable. They broke open magnificent silver and gold reliquaries with their axes and swords, spilling the contents onto the floor, grabbing the jeweled boxes, and often discarding the bones themselves as worthless. One chronicler describes them using the most sacred altars as tables for gambling and drinking, and seating prostitutes on the patriarch's throne. An abbot named Martin of Paris, a German cleric accompanying the crusade, provides a chillingly honest account. He describes walking into a church mid-pillage and seeing his fellow crusaders grabbing at gold and silver, ignoring the relics. He, being a more discerning collector, began to systematically gather up the sacred items himself. He describes filling the folds of his robes with as much as he could carry, coming across a container and not knowing what was inside, but taking it anyway. He writes of finding an old priest and threatening him with death until the priest showed him where the most precious relics were hidden, including, he claimed, a vial of the blood of Christ himself. This wasn't holy theft, justified by the will of a saint. This was a smash and grab, a violent, chaotic liquidation sale of the entire spiritual treasury of Eastern Christianity. When the dust settled and the Crusaders finally sailed home, their ships were laden with plunder, and a huge portion of that plunder was relics. Suddenly, the trickle of relics into Western Europe became a tidal wave. Relics that had been the stuff of legend were now available on the open market. The Bishop of Halberstadt returned to Germany with a staggering collection that included fingers from St. Stephen and St. James, a piece of St. Andrew's cross, and a thorn from the crown of thorns. The French king Louis X later purchased the entire crown of thorns itself from the indebted Latin emperor of Constantinople for an astronomical sum, and built the stunning Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, a chapel that is essentially a human-sized reliquary, to house it. The sack of Constantinople fundamentally and permanently altered the relic trade. It democratized it. Suddenly, even a minor cathedral or a provincial monastery could acquire a piece of a truly first-rate relic that had once been in the emperor's private chapel. It also caused a crisis of authenticity. In the chaos of the looting, provenance was completely lost. Who knew if that was really the finger of John the Baptist? It had been pulled from a pile of other bones in a ransacked church. The paperwork, so to speak, had been lost. This chaotic influx of unverified, high-value relics created the perfect environment for the final and most widespread branch of the supply chain to truly flourish: outright forgery. If you have a market where demand is insatiable, where the most valuable products are small, easily transportable, and almost impossible to authenticate, you have a forger's paradise. The relic forgery industry wasn't new, but after 1204, it went into overdrive. It became a sophisticated, continent-wide business, ranging from crude fakes sold to gullible peasants to master-level deceptions designed to fool even bishops and kings. Let's imagine how this shadow economy worked. Consider a workshop, perhaps in a back alley in Rome. Rome was a forger's dream. Its catacombs were a vast subterranean labyrinth filled with the bones of countless anonymous early Christians. For a forger, this was the raw material. It was a bone mine. Our forger, let's call him Brother Luca, could easily acquire a skull, a few vertebrae, or a tibia from these ancient forgotten graves. These were real, antique human bones, which was a good start. They just didn't belong to a famous saint. Yet, the next step was preparation, or what a modern art forger would call aging and distressing. The bones couldn't look like they were just dug up. They needed an aura of sanctity. So Luca might boil them in wine and spices, a process that would not only darken them to a respectable ancient hue, but also imbue them with a sweet perfumed scent, a cheap imitation of the legendary odor of sanctity. He might wrap them in fragments of old, expensive-looking silk, perhaps stained with a bit of animal blood to suggest the blood of a martyr. The physical object was only half the product. The other half, the more important half, was the story, the provenance. Brother Luca couldn't just sell a random perfumed skull. He had to sell the skull of Saint Pancras or Saint Sebastian, and for that, he needed a believable tale. He would become an expert storyteller. He would explain, with a pious and sorrowful expression, that this precious relic had been in his family for generations, passed down from a great-great-grandfather who was a soldier in the Holy Land. Or perhaps he was the agent of a noble Byzantine family, refugees from the sack of Constantinople, who were now destitute and forced to part with their most sacred heirloom. He might even produce a small, aged-looking piece of parchment with a description of the relic in bad Greek or Latin, a document he'd expertly faked himself, using acidic inks and leaving it out in the sun to make it look ancient. The forger's art was in knowing his market. For a simple village priest, a small, anonymous bone fragment presented as a companion of Saint Ursula might be enough. The priest wanted to believe, and his congregation was not likely to ask difficult questions. For a wealthy abbot or a nobleman, the fake had to be more elaborate. It would need a more convincing story, perhaps a small, crudely made leaden tag attached to it, like the kind found in Roman tombs. The most audacious forgers didn't just deal in bones. They produced a whole catalogue of holy hardware. Pieces of wood, usually from old olive trees or abandoned buildings, were sold by the thousands as fragments of the true cross. One of the great cynics of the Reformation, John Calvin, would later famously quip that if you gathered all the alleged pieces of the true cross from the churches of Europe, you could build a fleet of ships. He wasn't exaggerating by much. The creativity of the forgers knew no bounds. They produced vials of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, which was usually chalk dust mixed with water. They sold feathers from the wings of the Archangel Gabriel. They produced coals from the fire that martyred Saint Lawrence. One of the most bizarre and sought-after categories of relics were those connected to the physical body of Jesus himself, his baby teeth, his umbilical cord, and most famously, the holy foreskin, the supposed relic of Christ's circumcision. At one point in the late Middle Ages, at least a dozen different churches, including the Papal Chapel in Rome, claimed to possess the one and only genuine holy foreskin. It was a theological and biological impossibility that was simply papered over by faith and rivalry. You might be asking yourself, how could anyone believe this? How could they be so gullible? Weren't there any checks? Any methods of verification? The answer is yes, there were, but they were not the kind of checks we would recognize today. The medieval mind did not approach authenticity with the scientific or historical skepticism that we do. Their methods of verification were spiritual, not empirical. The number one test of a relic's authenticity was its ability to perform miracles. If you brought a new relic to your church, and suddenly the blind began to see and the lame began to walk, that was all the proof you needed. The relic worked. It was a genuine conduit of divine power. The fact that these healings might be psychosomatic, or coincidences, or simple temporary improvements was irrelevant. The connection was made, the relic arrived, a miracle happened, therefore the relic is real. This created a kind of feedback loop. A church would acquire a new relic, advertise its presence, and hopeful pilgrims would flock to it. With so many people desperately praying for a cure, it was statistically likely that someone would feel better. That miracle would then be publicized, attracting even more pilgrims, and further cementing the relic's reputation. It was, in essence, a system of divine customer reviews. Another test was the ordeal. Sometimes a contested relic would be subjected to a trial by fire or water. The belief was that a true relic could not be harmed. The relic would be placed into a roaring fire, and if it emerged unscathed, it was declared genuine. Of course, this test was usually performed on the metal reliquary containing the relic, not the fragile bone or piece of wood itself, but the symbolism was what mattered. But perhaps the most powerful force for authenticity was the container itself, the reliquary. Throughout the Middle Ages, staggering amounts of money and artistic skill were poured into creating magnificent containers for these relics. They were crafted from gold, silver, ivory, and covered in precious gems. The belief was that such a spiritually powerful object deserved a worthy vessel, but it also worked the other way around. The sheer material value and beauty of the reliquary conferred authenticity onto the object within. The unspoken assumption was that no one would spend a king's ransom to create a solid gold, jewel-encrusted arm to house a fake elbow bone. The expense of the packaging validated the product. If you saw a dusty bone on a wooden plank, you might be skeptical. If you saw the exact same bone housed inside a masterpiece of Gothic metalwork, your doubt would melt away into awe. This entire ecosystem of acquisition, legal, semi-legal, and illegal, fueled an intense and sometimes violent rivalry between cities, churches, and monasteries. Relics were not just objects of piety, they were instruments of power, prestige, and economic prosperity. Possessing a famous relic was like having a nuclear weapon in the spiritual arms race of the Middle Ages. It made you a destination. Pilgrims were the medieval equivalent of tourists, and they brought money. They needed places to eat, places to sleep, and they bought souvenirs and made donations to the church. A successful shrine could fund the entire economy of a town. This led to fierce competition. Churches would constantly try to outdo one another, claiming their piece of a saint was more important than their rivals. The Abbey of Saint Denis and the Cathedral of Chartres, both in France, feuded for years over who had the true head of Saint Denis. Both claimed to have it, and both produced elaborate stories to back up their claim. Cities would go to war over relics. The body of Saint Nicholas, the historical figure behind Santa Claus, was originally buried in Myra, in modern-day Turkey. In the 11th century, sailors from the Italian city of Bari launched a full-scale expedition, essentially a military raid, to steal his body. They were successful, and brought him back to Bari, which instantly became a major pilgrimage centre. Not to be outdone, Venetian sailors mounted their own raid on Myra a few years later, and carried off what they claimed were the remaining bone fragments the men from Bari had missed. For centuries, both Bari and Venice claimed to have the real Saint Nicholas. This was the bizarre, booming, and deeply human world of the holy supply chain. It was a world where faith was so tangible that you could hold it in your hand, so powerful that it could justify a crime, and so valuable that it could be bought, sold, and counterfeited like any other commodity. It was a system born from a genuine and profound desire to be closer to God, but that desire created a market so hungry that it inevitably twisted piety into politics, faith into finance, and devotion into a kind of grand, collective delusion. From the solemn procession of a translation to the grubby workshop of a forger, chipping away at a piece of old wood, the goal was the same: to supply the insatiable demand for a physical piece of the divine, and in doing so to capture a small piece of its power for oneself. The methods were varied, but the commodity was always hope, packaged in bone and sold for gold. And as the relics spread across Europe, a vast network of roads and rituals would spring up to accommodate the millions of people who now had a reason to leave their homes and travel in search of a miracle. The age of the great pilgrimage was about to begin. Chapter 3: Vessels of the Sacred, Reliquaries, Artistry, and Power. And so the age of the great pilgrimage was about to begin. Roads that had lain dormant for centuries, once trod by Roman legions, now stirred with new life. They filled with a slow, shuffling procession of humanity, farmers, merchants, knights, and nobles, all drawn by an invisible thread of faith. But as these weary travellers finally arrived at their destination, be it a grand cathedral in a bustling city, or a remote monastery perched on a windswept hill, what did they find? They had not walked hundreds of miles, braving bandits and bad weather, just to see a splinter of wood or a fragment of bone sitting unceremoniously on a stone altar. The prize at the end of this arduous journey had to be a spectacle. It had to be a confirmation that their faith, their sacrifice, and their donation were not in vain. You see, a holy relic, for all its spiritual weight, had a public relations problem. It was, in its raw state, often visually unimpressive. A piece of a saint's finger bone looks to the uninitiated eye remarkably like any other piece of finger bone. A thorn from the crown of thorns is still, fundamentally, a thorn. And so, the medieval world, with its profound understanding of symbolism and spectacle, developed the solution: the reliquary, the vessel. This was not mere packaging. This was theology made tangible. It was the absolute fusion of art, wealth, and power, designed to do for a relic what a crown does for a king, to leave no doubt in the mind of the beholder that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. You couldn't exactly show up with the collarbone of John the Baptist in a simple wooden box. It lacked a certain gravitas. It would be like serving a priceless vintage wine in a paper cup. The container had to reflect the sanctity of the contents, and more than that, it had to amplify it. The reliquary became a critical piece of spiritual technology, a divine amplifier that broadcasted the relic's holiness for all to see. It was a statement, written in gold and jewels, that said, "That which is contained within is so precious, so powerful, that all this earthly wealth is but a pale and humble shadow of its true value." So let's begin with the materials themselves. The choice of what to use in crafting a reliquary was never arbitrary. Every element was laden with meaning, a vocabulary of devotion understood by all. The undisputed king of materials was, of course, gold. Gold had the rather convenient and polite feature of not tarnishing or rusting. In a world where everything decayed, where wood rotted and iron rusted and flesh returned to dust, the gleaming, eternal incorruptibility of gold was seen as the perfect earthly echo of the incorruptibility of a saint's soul and the unchanging nature of heaven. To sheath a relic in gold was to wrap it in a little piece of the divine realm. It shimmered in the candlelight of a dark cathedral, a beacon of otherworldly light in the gloom, a promise of the golden streets of the New Jerusalem. Then there was silver, often gilded to look like gold, but a precious and noble material in its own right. It was bright, pure, and often associated with the Virgin Mary, the moon, and a kind of luminous clarity. Ivory, too, was highly prized. Harvested from the tusks of elephants or the teeth of walruses, its smooth, milky white surface was a symbol of purity and innocence. It was also a dream to carve, the intricate, delicate scenes that could be etched into ivory. Stories of the Gospels, lives of the saints were a testament to both the artist's skill and the value of the relic it housed. You could get a level of detail in ivory that was difficult to achieve in metal. a kind of narrative density that turned the reliquary itself into a storybook. And then there were the gems. Oh, the gems. To our modern eyes, accustomed to precision-cut diamonds, the gems on a medieval reliquary might look a little rustic. They were often cabochons, polished, smooth and domed, but not faceted. They were treasured not for their fiery sparkle, but for their deep, rich colour and their sheer size. Each colour was a word in a sacred sentence. Deep blue sapphires spoke of the heavens and of truth. Rich red rubies and garnets symbolized the blood of Christ and the sacrifice of the martyrs. Vibrant green emeralds represented faith, hope, and the promise of resurrection, and the clear crystalline quartz was a symbol of purity and spiritual clarity. These gems were not just decorative, they were functional. They were thought to have their own intrinsic powers, medicinal and spiritual properties that worked in harmony with the relic inside. A sapphire might ward off evil, an emerald could heal the sick. So, encrusting a reliquary with these stones was like adding extra layers of spiritual armor, boosting the holy signal emanating from within. And let's be honest, it was also an unapologetic display of wealth. The patron who commissioned the reliquary, be it a king, a bishop or an abbot, was not just honoring the saint, he was broadcasting his own piety, power, and the immense resources at his command. It was a spiritual investment and a political statement rolled into one. When you saw a reliquary blazing with gems that cost more than a dozen farms, you understood that the church or kingdom that owned it was a force to be reckoned with. Now, who were the masters who made these incredible objects? For the most part, they were anonymous. The modern idea of the celebrity artist signing their work and cultivating a personal brand was entirely foreign to the medieval mindset. These craftsmen were often monks, working in the quiet, dedicated workshops, the scriptoria and ateliers attached to great monasteries. A goldsmith was not seen as fundamentally different from the scribe illuminating a manuscript, or the stonemason carving a gargoyle. All were using their God-given talents to give glory to God. Their work was a prayer made manifest in metal, enamel, and stone. The techniques they used were astonishingly sophisticated. Consider the art of enameling, for instance. Champlevé enamel involved carving troughs into a metal plate, usually copper, and then filling these little valleys with powdered glass of different colours. The whole piece was then fired in a kiln, melting the glass into a smooth, vibrant and permanent layer of colour. The artisans of Limoges in France were particularly famous for this, creating reliquary caskets covered in brilliant blue, green and gold scenes that were exported all over Europe. Then there was the even more delicate technique of cloisonné, where thin strips of gold wire were soldered onto a surface to create little cells, or cloisons, which were then filled with enamel. It allowed for incredibly fine detail, a kind of painting with glass and gold. And filigree, the art of twisting fine threads of gold or silver into intricate lace-like patterns. And repoussé, the painstaking process of hammering a sheet of metal from the reverse side to create a raised design on the front. Imagine the workshop, the air thick with the smell of beeswax, charcoal fires, and hot metal, the quiet tapping of 100 tiny hammers, the scratch of a graver on a silver plate, the low murmur of chant drifting in from the chapel next door. These were not factories churning out products. They were laboratories of devotion, places where earthly materials were patiently, prayerfully transmuted into objects of heavenly beauty. The work was slow, meticulous, and incredibly expensive. A single large reliquary could take a team of master craftsmen years, even decades to complete. As the cult of relics grew, so too did the forms of the reliquaries themselves. They weren't all just ornate boxes. A new, wonderfully literal type of vessel emerged, what art historians call a speaking reliquary, or a reliquaire parlant. The idea was simple and brilliant. The container should be shaped like the relic it contains. So if you had a piece of a saint's skull, you would commission a reliquary in the shape of a golden head, often beautifully sculpted with lifelike features. If you possessed the arm bone of an apostle, it would be housed in a magnificent life-sized arm of silver gilt, often with the hand raised in a gesture of blessing. A finger relic? You'd get a jewel-encrusted golden finger, standing upright on an ornate base. From our modern perspective, there's something slightly macabre and almost comically direct about this. There's no ambiguity. You are leaving the pilgrim in absolutely no doubt about what they are venerating. It's as if the reliquary is saying, "Prist, in case you were wondering, the arm of Saint Bartholomew is in here." But to the medieval mind, this was perfectly logical. It created a powerful, immediate connection between the believer and the saint. You weren't just praying to an abstract concept, you were face to face with a golden effigy that contained the very physical remnant of the holy person themselves. These head reliquaries, with their calm, serene faces, inset with crystal eyes, seemed to gaze back at the supplicant, bridging the gap between heaven and earth. Other forms developed for specific high-status relics. A reliquary designed to hold a fragment of the true cross was called a storatheke, and it was almost always cross-shaped. A bursa reliquary was shaped like a purse or a satchel, a nod to the pouch Judas carried but redeemed and sanctified to carry a piece of the divine. And then there were the architectural reliquaries, tiny chapels and cathedrals in miniature, crafted from gold and silver, with little arched windows, flying buttresses, and soaring spires. These were particularly popular, as they reinforced the idea of the saint as a pillar of the church, and the church itself as the ultimate repository of the sacred. And all of this brings us to one of the most magnificent examples of the craft, an object of such scale and ambition that it became a destination in its own right, the Shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne Cathedral. This is the heavyweight champion of reliquaries. It's less a casket and more a golden basilica. Begun in 1181 and taking over 40 years to complete, it was designed by one of the few medieval artists whose name we actually know, a goldsmith of genius named Nicholas of Verdun. Imagine seeing it for the first time. You've walked for months to get to Cologne. You enter the vast, soaring space of the new Gothic cathedral, itself still a building site. The air is cool and smells of stone dust and incense. And there, behind the high altar, it sits, a sarcophagus over 6 feet long, nearly 4 feet wide, and 5 feet tall. It is a solid wall of gold, silver, and dazzling enamel, encrusted with over 1,000 gemstones and pearls, and dozens of antique Roman cameos and intaglios, themselves considered precious treasures. It is built like a 3-naved church, with prophets and apostles sitting in rows along the sides, and scenes from the life of Christ unfolding across its surface. It's not just an object, it's an entire universe of sacred narrative rendered in the most precious materials on earth. And inside, the purported skulls and bones of the Magi, the 3 wise men who had travelled to witness the birth of Christ. The relics themselves were a masterstroke of political and religious acquisition, brought to Cologne in 1164 by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa after he'd sacked the city of Milan. Getting these relics was a coup. It was like a modern city winning the right to host the Olympics, but permanently. Cologne was instantly transformed. It became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Christendom, rivaling Rome and Santiago de Compostela. The shrine was the city's brand, its crown jewel, and its economic engine. The donations from millions of pilgrims over centuries funded the construction of the colossal cathedral that was built around it. The reliquary didn't just house the relics, it created the very reason for the cathedral's existence. The city's fortunes were now inextricably linked to this gleaming golden box. The relationship was symbiotic. The relics made the shrine precious, but the shrine's undeniable, overwhelming magnificence convinced everyone of the relic's authenticity and power. Who would invest such staggering wealth, such breathtaking artistry, in something that wasn't real? The sheer expense was its own proof. It was a circular, self-reinforcing logic of faith and finance, and it worked brilliantly. But even the Shrine of the Three Kings was, in the end, an object placed within a building. The ultimate logical conclusion of the reliquary's evolution was to not just build a container for a relic, but to make the building itself the reliquary. And for that we must travel to Paris, to the court of the pious and politically astute King Louis X. Louis had, in the 1230s and 40s, managed to acquire the single most prestigious collection of relics in the Christian world, the relics of the Passion of Christ. This included, most importantly, the crown of thorns, as well as a large piece of the true cross, the holy lance, and the holy sponge. He purchased them, at an astronomical cost, from Baldwin II, the cash-strapped Latin emperor of Constantinople. The price Louis paid for the crown of thorns alone was 135,000 livres, a sum that was more than half of the entire annual revenue of the French kingdom. Forget saving up for a new palace. This was a budget that could fund a major war. But for Louis, it was the ultimate investment. By bringing the very instruments of Christ's suffering to Paris, he was making a bold theological and political claim. He was saying that Paris was the new Jerusalem, that the French monarchy was now the preeminent guardian of Christendom. These relics were too important for a mere box. No matter how golden or bejeweled, they required their own universe, and so he commissioned the Sainte-Chapelle. To step inside the upper chapel of Sainte-Chapelle, even today, is to understand what he was trying to achieve. It is perhaps the closest anyone has ever come to building a heavenly jewel box on earth. The stone structure seems to vanish. The walls are not walls. They are vast, shimmering curtains of stained glass, over 50 feet high, depicting more than 1,000 biblical scenes in brilliant blues, reds, and purples. You feel as though you are standing inside a gemstone, breathing in the stories of prophets and saints. It is an experience of total, overwhelming sensory immersion. And at the far end, in the apse, stood a grand platform, a stage upon which the great reliquary itself was displayed on feast days. The building was designed as a monumental frame, an architectural setting whose entire purpose was to lead the eye and the soul towards the sacred objects it was built to protect. The king himself would sometimes act as the master of ceremonies, carrying the relics in procession. It was the ultimate piece of royal and religious theatre. Louis IX hadn't just bought a relic, he had built a permanent home for it, that dissolved the boundaries between the earthly and the divine, and in doing so cemented the sanctity of his own rule. Sainte-Chapelle is the reliquary, as architecture, the final, breathtaking statement in the medieval conversation between faith, art, and power. Of course, with such immense value, both spiritual and material, concentrated in these objects came immense risk. Reliquaries were prime targets for thieves. Cathedral treasuries were the Fort Knox of their day, and they were often plundered during times of war and unrest. During the Viking raids, monks would flee their monasteries with little more than their most sacred relics and the precious vessels that held them. There are countless tales of relics being hidden, buried in fields or sealed up in walls to protect them from marauding armies. And this concentration of wealth also led to a darker side of the trade. Just as there was a booming market in fake relics, there was also a market in what you might politely call repurposed materials. An ancient Roman cameo, a beautiful piece of pagan art, would be pried from its original setting and incorporated into a cross or a casket. Its original meaning was erased, and it was baptized into Christian service, its beauty now used to glorify a saint. There was a certain ruthless pragmatism to it. Why let a perfectly good sapphire go to waste just because it used to belong to a pagan emperor? The financing of these projects was a major undertaking. It was the medieval equivalent of a massive public works project, like building a modern airport or a sports stadium. The funds came from everywhere. Kings and queens would donate vast sums from the royal treasury. Wealthy nobles would bequeath land and gold in their wills, hoping to secure a saint's favor for their soul in the afterlife. But a huge portion came from the pilgrims themselves. The system of donations was sophisticated. You could pay to have a candle lit. You could buy a small metal badge, a pilgrim's souvenir, to prove you had been there. And for a significant donation, you could receive an indulgence, a remission of time your soul would have to spend in purgatory. It was a powerful incentive. The reliquary, in this sense, was not just a holy object. It was the anchor of a massive economic enterprise. The initial investment in its creation would be paid back 1,000 times over by the endless stream of pilgrims it attracted. The money flowed in, funding the clergy, the maintenance of the church, the local economy of innkeepers and food sellers, and of course the commissioning of even more splendid art and architecture to further enhance the site's prestige. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of devotion and commerce. But let us return to the individual, the weary pilgrim standing before one of these masterpieces for the first time. They would not have been able to get close. These objects were kept behind grilles, on high altars, brought out only on special occasions. The viewer's experience was carefully managed. They would see it from a distance, through a haze of incense smoke, the flickering of 100 candles making the gold and gems dance and shimmer. They would hear the soaring sound of the choir echoing through the stone vaults. The experience was designed to be overwhelming, to bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the soul. It was a form of communication more powerful than any sermon. It didn't require literacy. It didn't require an understanding of complex theology. It required only that you open your eyes. The message was clear and unambiguous. God is real. Heaven is glorious. The saints are powerful, and the church is their mighty fortress here on earth. The reliquary was the glittering, irrefutable evidence. These vessels of the sacred are a paradox. They are objects of profound, heartfelt piety, born from a genuine desire to honor God and his saints. They are also instruments of political power, advertisements for the wealth of a king or a bishop. They are masterpieces of artistic and technical skill, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in their time. And they are engines of commerce, the focal point of a tourism industry that shaped the map of medieval Europe. They represent a mindset that is in many ways alien to our own, a world where the spiritual and the material were not seen as separate domains, but as deeply and inextricably interwoven. The beauty of the physical object was a gateway to understanding the beauty of the spiritual truth it contained. The value of the gold was a measure of the pricelessness of the soul. As we sit here now in the quiet of our own rooms, it's a world that is hard to fully grasp, but in the glint of a gilded surface, in the deep, serene color of a sapphire, we can still catch a faint echo of that lost world, a world that believed you could build a bridge to heaven with your own two hands, using gold and glass and prayer. The reliquary was that bridge, a shining testament to the enduring human need to give the intangible a home and the divine a face. Chapter 4. The Divine Economy, Pilgrimage, Markets and Miracles. And so the reliquary became the bridge, a shining, meticulously crafted pathway from the messy, uncertain world of the living to the serene promise of the divine. But a bridge, no matter how beautiful, is a static thing. It exists for the crossing. It implies movement, a journey from one side to another. And once these incredible objects were built, once a piece of bone was enshrined in gold, and a splinter of wood was cradled in crystal, it began to exert a kind of gravitational pull. It didn't just sit there to be admired by a few local monks. It became a destination, a magnet for the hopes, fears, and weary feet of all Christendom. The reliquary was the destination, but the journey was everything. It was the lifeblood of this entire system. It was an industry built on faith, a booming economy powered by prayer and desperation, where the currency was penance and the profit was salvation. This was the age of the pilgrimage, and we need to be very clear about what this meant. This wasn't a modern vacation. This wasn't booking a flight, packing a suitcase with comfortable shoes, and worrying about whether the hotel had decent Wi-Fi. This was a monumental undertaking, a decision that could consume months, even years of a person's life. It was a profound act of faith that often doubled as the biggest adventure and the biggest risk they would ever take. Imagine, just for a moment, that you are a peasant farmer in a small, damp village in northern England. Your world is small. It's defined by the local church spire, the next market town, and the rhythm of the seasons. The furthest you have ever travelled is perhaps 20 miles, a journey that took a full day. Your life is governed by a constant, low-level anxiety. The harvest might fail, the Lord might raise your taxes, your child has a fever that won't break, and the local healer has done all she can. And permeating everything is a much deeper, more profound anxiety, the state of your immortal soul. You've listened to the sermons of the parish priest, his words painting vivid, terrifying pictures of the fires of hell and the endless grey waiting of purgatory. You are acutely aware of your own sinfulness, that flash of anger, that moment of envy, the small lies told to a neighbour. They all add up, they are a weight on your soul. And then, one day, a travelling friar or a merchant passes through your village, and he speaks of a place hundreds and hundreds of miles to the south, in a land called Spain, a place called Santiago de Compostela. He tells of a magnificent cathedral where the actual bones of the Apostle St. James the Greater are kept. He speaks of miracles, the blind regaining their sight, the lame walking again, and he speaks of the spiritual benefits, that by simply making the journey, by walking that long, hard road and praying before the relics of the saint, you can earn an indulgence, a remission of the temporal punishment for your sins, a shortening of your time, or a loved one's time, in that dreadful waiting place of purgatory. Suddenly, the world feels different. There is a tangible solution, a physical act you can perform to effect a spiritual reality. It's an idea of incredible power. The journey itself becomes a prayer. Every sore foot, every hungry evening, every cold night spent sleeping in a barn becomes an offering. It's a way of taking control, of doing something active in a life that is so often crushingly passive. And so the decision is made. You sell a pig. You mend your leather shoes as best you can. You sew a scallop shell emblem onto your cloak, the symbol of St. James, and with a small bag of coins and an enormous reserve of faith, you kiss your family goodbye and start walking south. You are now a pilgrim, one of millions who are crisscrossing the continent, creating invisible, powerful currents of movement that would reshape the world. This massive movement of people, this continental tide of devotion, required an infrastructure. You can't have millions of people walking across Europe without a system in place to support them, and a vast, sprawling and often chaotic ecosystem grew up along these sacred routes. The first and most obvious component was the road itself. We tend to think of Roman roads as these great permanent arteries, and some were still in use, but many were in a state of profound disrepair, full of potholes and overgrown with weeds. The vast majority of a pilgrim's journey would have been on simple dirt tracks, which turned to sucking mud in the rain and choking dust in the sun. The road was a constant physical challenge. It was an antagonist you battled with every single step. And along these roads, a network of support began to form. The most important were the hospices and monasteries. These were the service stations of the medieval world. Monastic orders, like the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitaller, and various local brotherhoods, saw it as their Christian duty to provide shelter for these travellers of God. A pilgrim could often expect a bed for the night, a simple meal, usually bread, a vegetable stew, some watered-down wine or ale, and care for their perpetually aching feet. The ideal was one of pure charity, but the reality was, of course, far more complicated. Imagine a popular hospice on the main route through France during the peak season in spring. It wasn't a quiet, contemplative refuge. It was a crowded, noisy, and frankly smelly place. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of pilgrims would be packed into a large dormitory, sleeping on straw pallets on the floor. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and wood smoke. The snoring would be a symphony of exhaustion. Lice and fleas were constant companions, and the risk of contracting a disease from your fellow travellers was very real. Yet, for all its discomfort, it was a haven. It was a roof over your head, a brief respite from the wind and the rain, and a place of camaraderie. Here, a farmer from England could share a piece of bread with a weaver from Flanders and a stonemason from Germany, all bound by the same purpose, all sharing the same hardships. Stories were exchanged, advice was given on the road ahead, which bridges were out, which lords were demanding outrageous tolls, which streams had potable water. These hospices were the melting pots of Europe, vital nodes in the network of faith. But charity alone couldn't sustain the entire system, and where there are travellers, there is commerce. Towns and villages that found themselves strategically located on a major pilgrimage route experienced an economic boom that would be the envy of any modern tourist town. A whole service industry emerged. Local people became guides, offering to lead groups of pilgrims through treacherous mountain passes or unfamiliar forests, for a fee, of course. Ferrymen made a good living poulting travellers across rivers. Every town had its blacksmiths, essential for mending worn-out shoe buckles or the iron tips of walking staffs. And then there were the markets. The marketplace in a pilgrimage town was a vibrant, chaotic explosion of sights and smells. You had food vendors selling everything from roasted meats to hard, dry bread that would last for days in a traveller's sack. You had people selling leather pouches, sturdy shoes and thick woolen cloaks. And you had the money changers. A pilgrim starting in Germany would be carrying German coins, but by the time they reached France, they'd need French currency. Crossing into Spain required another exchange. The money changers, with their little tables and scales, were the indispensable and often predatory bankers of the road. They set the exchange rates, and a naive pilgrim could easily find their travel funds shrinking with every border they crossed. Let's take a closer look at the most famous of these routes, the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James. This wasn't a single road, but a convergence of many paths, like streams flowing into a great river, all leading to that one cathedral in the northwest corner of Spain. The journey was epic. From Paris, It was roughly 1,000 miles. A good pace for a pilgrim on foot was about 15 to 20 miles a day, so you're looking at a journey of 2 to 3 months, one way, and that's if everything went well. The sheer logistics are mind-boggling. You had to navigate using the sun, the stars, and local landmarks. You were constantly exposed to the elements. A sudden summer storm could wash out a road or flood a river, causing days of delay. A harsh winter could make the passes through the Pyrenees Mountains utterly impassable. And then there were the human dangers. The roads were not policed. Bandits were a constant threat, seeing this steady stream of travellers as an easy source of income. A pilgrim was advised to travel in groups for safety, turning the solitary spiritual journey into a communal effort of survival. We even have a guidebook from the 12th century, the Codex Calixtinus. It's a remarkable document, part travel guide, part liturgical manual, and it's wonderfully, brutally honest. It reads like a medieval TripAdvisor. The author, a French scholar named Aymeric Picot, gives detailed descriptions of the route, the towns, and the various shrines along the way, but he also gives scathing reviews of the locals. He warns pilgrims about the treacherous Basques who hide in the mountains to rob them. He complains endlessly about the greedy innkeepers in certain towns, the foul quality of the water in one river, and the disgusting food in another region. It's a vivid reminder that this was not an ethereal, spiritual float across the landscape. It was a gritty, difficult, and often deeply unpleasant physical ordeal, punctuated by moments of profound beauty and spiritual connection. And along the way, the economy of faith was present at every step. Local churches, even small parish churches, would advertise their own minor relics. Perhaps they had a finger bone of a local saint, or a piece of cloth from a martyr's tunic. They knew pilgrims passing through were in a spiritually receptive and often generous state of mind. They would encourage travellers to stop, to pray, and to leave a small donation. Every church wanted a piece of the action. It was a competition for the pilgrims' attention and their coins. Some of these smaller shrines became major destinations in their own right, creating a whole constellation of sacred sites that dotted the main routes. A journey to Santiago was never just a journey to Santiago. It was a journey punctuated by dozens of other holy encounters, each with its own spiritual transaction. The most sought-after souvenirs of the Camino were the scallop shells. Pilgrims would pick them up on the coast of Galicia after reaching Santiago, or buy them from vendors in the city. The shell became the ultimate proof that you had completed the journey. It was a badge of honor, a medieval "I climbed Mount Everest" t-shirt. Wearing it on your journey home afforded you a certain status and protection. People were more likely to offer you food and shelter, seeing that you were a true pilgrim returning from your sacred quest. The shell itself took on a semi-sacred status, a physical object that was imbued with the spiritual power of the entire journey. And of course, a thriving market in scallop shells grew up, with vendors selling them for whatever the market would bear. The line between a sacred emblem and a commercial product was, as always, wonderfully blurry. After months on the road, after surviving the mud, the mountains, the bandits, and the bad food, our pilgrim would finally arrive. Imagine cresting a hill and seeing for the first time the spires of the great Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela rising in the distance. The sense of relief, of accomplishment, of spiritual fulfillment must have been overwhelming. But arriving in the city was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of the final and most important phase. The city itself would have been a shock to the senses for someone from a small village. It was a bustling, international metropolis. The streets were thronged with people from every corner of Christendom, a babble of different languages filling the air. It was crowded, it was loud, and it was commercial. Stalls lined the streets leading to the cathedral, selling candles, food, religious trinkets, and of course more scallop shells. There were professional prayer sayers you could hire to pray for you if you were too exhausted. There were scribes who would write letters home for you, for a price. The entire city was a machine, expertly designed to serve and to profit from the unceasing river of pilgrims. And then, the cathedral. These great pilgrimage churches were not just places of worship, they were masterpieces of crowd control. The architecture itself was a solution to a logistical problem: how to get thousands of people a day in to see the sacred relic without disrupting the constant cycle of services being held by the monks or clergy at the main altar. The answer was the ambulatory, This was a wide, continuous aisle that wrapped around the main altar and the choir. Opening off this aisle were a series of small, radiating chapels. This brilliant design allowed the stream of pilgrims to flow constantly through the building. They could enter through a side door, walk around the ambulatory, visit the various chapels with their secondary relics, and finally approach the main shrine behind the altar, before exiting through another door, all without ever disturbing the central functions of the church. It was a sacred conveyor belt. As you, the pilgrim, entered the vast, cool darkness of the cathedral, the experience would have been overwhelming. The air, thick with the sweet, heavy scent of centuries of incense, was a welcome relief from the stench of the crowded streets. The sound was a low hum of shuffling feet and whispered prayers, punctuated by the soaring, ethereal chants of the choir. Light, filtered through stained glass windows, would have painted kaleidoscopic patterns on the stone floors. This was a space designed to inspire awe, to make you feel small and insignificant in the presence of God's majesty. You would shuffle along in the slow-moving queue, your heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. You'd pass chapels containing other holy treasures, the arm of one saint, the head of another, each housed in its own glittering reliquary. And finally, you would reach the main event, the crypt beneath the high altar, where a magnificent silver casket was said to contain the very bones of St. James. You might not have been able to get very close. You might only have glimpsed it through a decorated screen, but that was enough. You would fall to your knees, the cold stone a shock through your thin trousers, and you would pour out your heart. You'd pray for your sick child, for the soul of your deceased parents, for forgiveness for your own countless failings. You would leave your offering, the few coins you had carefully saved for this exact moment, dropping them into a heavily fortified collection box. That clink of coin on coin was the sound of the divine economy at work. This moment, this deeply personal and emotional climax of a months-long journey, was the engine that drove everything. It was the product being sold, and the church had become incredibly sophisticated in how it monetized this experience. The primary revenue stream, of course, was the direct donations. The collection boxes at a major shrine like Santiago, Canterbury, or Rome collected a staggering amount of wealth. It was this money that funded the constant expansion and embellishment of the cathedrals themselves. A popular relic essentially paid for its own glorious home. If a shrine started to attract more pilgrims, the church would use the income to build a bigger, more magnificent church, which in turn would attract even more pilgrims, creating a virtuous cycle of faith and finance. The great Gothic cathedrals that grace the European landscape are in many ways monuments built by the collective small change of millions of hopeful, weary travellers. But the financial ingenuity went far beyond simple donations. A key innovation was the concept of the indulgence. This is a practice that would later become famously controversial, but in the High Middle Ages, it was a central part of the spiritual landscape. The theology was complex, but the basic pitch to the average person was simple. The saints, by virtue of their holy lives, had stored up a surplus of spiritual merit, a kind of treasury of grace, which the Church, through the authority given to it by Christ, could dispense. An indulgence was not a forgiveness of sin itself, that required confession and repentance. Rather, it was a remission of the temporal punishment due for that sin, the time one would have to spend in purgatory, being purified before entering heaven. Visiting a major relic on a particular feast day, or performing certain prescribed prayers, could earn you an indulgence. It was a way to actively manage your spiritual well-being, and while, in theory, indulgences couldn't be bought, they were almost always tied to an act that involved a financial contribution. You received the indulgence for visiting the shrine, but it was expected, and strongly encouraged, that you would make a pious donation as part of that visit. From there, it was a very short step to the perception that you were, in essence, buying a fast track out of purgatory. For a population terrified of the afterlife, this was an incredibly compelling offer. It was spiritual insurance, and they were willing to pay the premiums. Then there was the vast market for secondary, or contact, relics. Not everyone could take home a piece of St. James's shin bone. The primary relic had to remain intact to keep the pilgrims coming. But you could take home an object that had acquired holiness by association. This was the practice of creating brandar. Pilgrims would buy small strips of cloth, or bring their own, and lower them through a grate to touch the tomb of the saint. This cloth was now considered a relic in its own right, a conduit for the saint's power. It was an ingenious way to create an infinite supply of sacred souvenirs from a finite original object. This practice soon evolved into a full-blown merchandise industry. Shrines would produce and sell pilgrim badges. These were small, cheap objects, usually made of a lead-tin alloy, that were mass-produced using molds. Each shrine had its own unique design. In Canterbury, it was a small metal ampulla or flask, said to contain a drop of water, miraculously tinged with the blood of St. Thomas Becket. In Santiago, it was the scallop shell. These badges were the medieval equivalent of a band t-shirt or a sticker for your car. They proved where you'd been, and demonstrated your piety. Pilgrims would sew them onto their hats and cloaks, accumulating them from the various shrines they visited. An experienced pilgrim's cloak would be covered in these little metal signs, a visual resume of their spiritual journeys. And every single badge, every ampulla, represented a small transaction, another coin dropped into the coffers of the church. When archaeologists excavate the medieval riverbeds in cities like London, they find thousands of these pilgrim badges, discarded or accidentally dropped, a testament to the sheer scale of this trade. This whole system, while fueled by genuine faith, was also ripe for abuse. The line between selling a sacred object and selling spiritual grace, the sin of simony, was dangerously thin and frequently crossed. Bishops and abbots were, in many ways, running massive corporations. They were responsible for huge budgets, vast building projects, and the management of a complex and lucrative tourist trade. The temptation to maximize revenue was immense. Some shrines were accused of inventing miracles, of exaggerating the healing powers of their relics to attract more visitors. Preachers were sent out on fundraising tours, carrying portable reliquaries, and offering indulgences to provincial towns in exchange for donations, essentially taking the mountain to Muhammad and collecting the profits. And of course there was the constant problem of forgeries. In a market where a single high-profile relic could guarantee the economic future of your town or monastery for centuries, the temptation to create one was overwhelming. The trade in fake relics was rampant. Unscrupulous dealers, known as pardoners, would travel the countryside with chests full of bones and trinkets, claiming they were the relics of famous saints. They would prey on the faith and ignorance of rural populations, selling pigs' bones as the knuckles of an apostle, or scraps of ordinary cloth as pieces of the Virgin Mary's veil. The famous joke that there were enough splinters of the true cross in circulation to build a whole fleet of ships was not far from the truth. There were at least 3 different churches that claimed to have the head of John the Baptist. It was an unregulated market driven by intense demand, and the usual consequences followed. This divine economy was more than just a sideshow to medieval life. It was a central pillar of it. The movement of pilgrims was one of the great unifying forces in a fragmented Europe. It was the medieval internet, a network along which ideas, news, artistic styles, and even diseases travelled. A French mason on pilgrimage to Spain might see a new way of vaulting a ceiling and bring that idea back to his hometown. A merchant from Italy might hear a new song from a German pilgrim and carry it south. These routes were conduits of cultural exchange on a massive scale. Furthermore, the wealth generated by this economy literally shaped the map. Towns that were on a pilgrimage route thrived, while those that were bypassed withered. The need for safe passage led to the building of bridges and the improvement of roads. The demand for services led to the growth of entire urban centres around the great cathedrals, and the political power that came with possessing a first-rate relic was immense. A king who could claim the patronage of a major saint, and who controlled the shrine where that saint's body lay, had a powerful tool of legitimacy. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he did so with a papal banner and relics, framing his invasion as a holy quest. Owning the right bones was a geopolitical asset. A relic could secure a political alliance, justify a war, or guarantee the succession of a dynasty. It was a system of incredible complexity, a blend of the most profound faith and the most cynical commerce. For the individual pilgrim, like our farmer from England, the journey was likely the most significant event of his life. He wasn't thinking about the macroeconomic impact of his donation. He was thinking about his soul, about his family, about fulfilling a vow to a saint who he believed could intervene on his behalf with God himself. The hardships of the road were a form of purification, the final arrival a moment of genuine spiritual ecstasy. His faith was real and deep. For the abbot of the monastery that housed the relic, the perspective was different. He too was a man of faith, but he was also a man with a payroll to meet, a leaky roof to repair, and a rival monastery down the road that was trying to attract his pilgrims. He saw the relic not just as a sacred object, but as an endowment, a source of capital that ensured the survival and prosperity of his institution. He saw the pilgrims as a spiritual flock to be ministered to, but also as a revenue stream to be managed. And so the great engine turned, fueled by the hopes of the many and managed by the ingenuity of the few. It was this engine that paid for the stonemasons, the glassmakers, the sculptors, and the architects who built the towering monuments of faith that still dominate the European skyline. When you stand today in a great cathedral like Chartres or Canterbury, you are standing inside a testament to this divine economy. The soaring vaults, the jewel-like windows, the intricate carvings, all of it was made possible by the accumulated donations of millions of people who walked hundreds of miles, seeking a miracle, a cure, or a moment of grace. It's easy for us now, in our secular age, to look back and see only the commercialism, the corruption, the gullibility, but that's only half the story. To dismiss it as such is to miss the immense power of the belief that underpinned it all. It was a world that saw the sacred and the profane not as separate spheres, but as deeply and inextricably intertwined. You could do business with God. You could perform a physical act, a journey, a donation, and expect a spiritual result. That golden reliquary, shining in the candlelight, was not just a beautiful box. It was a fixed point in a turning world, a spiritual and economic powerhouse, the still center of a vast, churning, and endlessly fascinating web of devotion, travel, and trade. As we settle in here, in the quiet of the night, it's worth remembering that for centuries, the sound of progress wasn't the roar of an engine, but the soft, shuffling footfalls of millions of pilgrims on a dusty road, walking towards a light in the distance. Chapter 5. From Veneration to Vilification, Reformation, Enlightenment, and Legacy. But a road, even one travelled for 1,000 years, is not immune to the quiet turning of a page. While those millions of shuffling footfalls created a deep and steady rhythm across Europe, another, much quieter sound was beginning to make itself heard. It was the sound of a scholar's lamp sputtering late into the night, the rustle of vellum in a university library, the scratch of a quill as a new and rather dangerous question was being formed. The light in the distance, which had guided so many for so long, was about to be examined, and some were beginning to wonder if it was a divine beacon or just a trick of the light. The foundations of the great relic trade, which had seemed as solid as the stone of the cathedrals that housed them, had always had a few hairline cracks. For centuries, the sheer volume of relics had been a kind of inside joke among the more cynical clergy. There was the old saying that if you collected all the fragments of the true cross scattered across Christendom, you could build a whole fleet of ships. If you gathered all the milk of the Virgin Mary, you could fill a river. These were exaggerations, of course, but they pointed to a quiet, nagging awareness that the system was, shall we say, prone to enthusiasm over accuracy. As the late Middle Ages waned, this quiet cynicism began to find a voice. Men like the English scholar John Wycliffe, and a bit later, the Bohemian priest Jan Hus, were among the first to take these private doubts and air them in public. They began to advance a truly radical idea, that the ultimate source of spiritual authority wasn't a bishop, a pope, or even a saint's fingerbone in a golden box. It was a book, the Bible. They suggested quite politely at first that perhaps the church had become a little distracted by all its beautiful shiny things, that perhaps the direct relationship between a person and God, through Scripture, had been cluttered up with 1,000 intermediaries, saints and relics acting as a kind of celestial bureaucracy. You had to navigate to get your prayers heard. This was, to put it mildly, not a popular opinion with the management. It was like telling a massive multinational corporation that its entire business model was based on a faulty premise. Jan Hus, for his troubles, was burned at the stake, but the ideas he and Wycliffe championed didn't burn with him. They smouldered, embers waiting for the right wind to be fanned into a blaze. That wind, it turned out, was a German invention, the printing press. and the man who would fan the flames was an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther. Luther wasn't initially trying to burn the whole house down. He was just a deeply devout, deeply troubled man who looked at the relic and indulgence trade of his day and saw something that looked less like sincere devotion and more like a spiritual pyramid scheme. He saw the agents of the church selling forgiveness, selling time out of purgatory, backed by the promise of the saints whose relics were on display, and it drove him to distraction. In 1517, he famously posted his 95 Theses, which were essentially 95 bullet points outlining his grievances, on the church door in Wittenberg. It's often portrayed as a grand act of defiance, and it was, but it's also helpful to think of it as the most consequential letter to the editor ever written. He was an academic trying to start a debate, but thanks to the printing press, his ideas didn't just stay in Wittenberg, they went viral. Suddenly, his critique of the church's finances and its reliance on relics was being read and debated in pubs and palaces from Germany to England. Luther's argument was powerful, because it was simple. He argued that faith alone was the path to salvation. You didn't need to buy a pardon, you didn't need to make a pilgrimage to see a splinter of wood, you didn't need to pay a fee to gaze upon the knuckle of a saint. All these things, he claimed, were distractions. They were human inventions, beautiful and compelling perhaps, but they were a veil between the believer and God. He called the veneration of relics a useless, deceptive and foolish thing. He saw the magnificent reliquaries not as vessels of holiness, but as gilded traps for the soul, and just as importantly, a drain on the purse of the common man. He asked why the Pope, who was wealthier than the richest kings, didn't build St. Peter's Basilica with his own money, instead of the money of poor believers who bought indulgences backed by the treasury of relics. If Luther threw the first stone, a French theologian named John Calvin arrived with a battering ram. Calvin was even more severe, more intellectually rigorous in his condemnation. For him, the problem wasn't just that the relics were probably fake, or that they were being used to fleece the faithful. The problem was that they were idols. Period. He argued from the second commandment, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image." He looked at a peasant kneeling before the shimmering arm bone of St. Anthony, and he didn't see piety. He saw idolatry, plain and simple. He saw a human being worshipping a created object, a piece of a dead body, instead of the invisible, all-powerful Creator. For Calvin and his followers, the Catholic Church wasn't just corrupt, it was fundamentally wrong. The sensory richness of it all, the incense, the statues, the stained glass, the shining reliquaries, was a trap for the senses, pulling people away from the pure, unadorned Word of God. The solution, therefore, wasn't just to reform the system, it was to tear it down. And so began what historians politely call the iconoclasm. Across huge swathes of northern Europe, in Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, England and Scotland, a wave of religious fervour swept through the churches, intent on purification. It was a kind of spiritual Marie Kondoing of the sacred spaces. But instead of asking if an object sparked joy, the question was whether it was an idol, and for the reformers, the answer for almost everything was a resounding yes. Imagine the scene, a cathedral that for 500 years had been a kaleidoscope of colour and light. Its walls were covered in paintings of saints, its niches held carved statues, its windows were jewelled with stories in stained glass, and at its heart, on the high altar, stood a magnificent reliquary of gold and crystal. For generations this was the unquestioned centre of the world for the people of the town. Now a crowd, fired up by a sermon from a Protestant preacher, pours into the church. The sound must have been terrifying. The crash of hammers against stone, shattering the faces of apostles carved a century before. The splintering of wood as painted altarpieces were torn from their hinges and hacked to pieces. The sickening, musical shattering of vast stained glass windows, plunging the sacred space into a grey, secular light. And the reliquaries, the objects of so much devotion and expense, were the primary targets. They were ripped open. The bones and ashes inside, once considered the most precious things on earth, were unceremoniously scattered, thrown into rivers, or burned in public bonfires. The gold and silver casings were seized, often melted down to fund the state or the Protestant cause. In Zurich, under the influence of the reformer Huldrych Zwingli, the process was more orderly, but no less absolute. Churches were systematically stripped. The walls were whitewashed, covering over the vibrant frescoes. The statues were removed. The altars were replaced with simple communion tables. The result was a space of stark, austere simplicity. The visual language of faith was completely rewritten. Where once there had been 100 things to look at, 100 saints to appeal to, there was now only the pulpit, the Bible, and the plain, unadorned light of God. It was a total sensory reset, a deliberate move from the visual to the auditory, from the image to the word. For the reformers, this was a righteous and necessary act. They were cleansing the temple, removing the temptations of idolatry, and returning the church to its pure apostolic roots. But for us, looking back from our quiet, secular vantage point, it's impossible not to also see it as a cultural catastrophe. Countless works of medieval art, priceless artifacts of human creativity and devotion, were destroyed in these waves of iconoclastic fury. An entire visual and spiritual world built up over a millennium was dismantled in a few short decades. It was the violent, messy, and often tragic end of the age of relics in half of Christendom. Now, you might think that with its northern territories on fire, spiritually speaking, the Catholic Church would simply abandon the whole relic enterprise as a lost cause, but that's not what happened at all. The Catholic Church, faced with the most serious threat to its existence in 1,000 years, responded not by retreating, but by reforming and doubling down. This response is known as the Counter-Reformation, and its centerpiece was a series of very long, very important meetings called the Council of Trent, which dragged on for the better part of 2 decades in the mid-16th century. Think of the Council of Trent as the biggest internal review in corporate history. The Church looked at every single one of the Protestants' critiques and had to formulate a response. When it came to relics, they essentially said, "You're right about the mess, but you're wrong about the principle." The council formally decreed that the veneration of saints and their relics was a good and useful practice. They reaffirmed that the saints intercede with God on behalf of humanity, and that their physical remains were worthy of honor. They weren't about to abandon a tradition that had been central to the faith for over 1,200 years. But they also knew they had a serious quality control problem. The age of freelance relics, of anonymous bones being given grand histories, of entrepreneurial monks selling questionable artifacts from a cart, that had to end. The Council of Trent put in place a new, much stricter set of rules. From now on, no new relic could be venerated without the express approval of the local bishop. The bishop was now the official authenticator, the gatekeeper. This was an attempt to shut down the black market, to curb the most egregious frauds, and to restore a sense of order and credibility to the system. It professionalized the relic. And the response wasn't just administrative, it was aesthetic. If the Protestants wanted whitewashed walls and bare rooms, the Baroque art of the Counter-Reformation would give the world churches that exploded with drama, emotion, and gilded splendor. This was faith as theater, designed to overwhelm the senses and inspire awe, and relics were a key part of this. Reliquaries became even more elaborate, more theatrical. A fascinating part of this Catholic revival was the rediscovery of the Roman catacombs. In 1578, workers accidentally broke through into a vast network of ancient Christian burial tunnels, packed with the remains of what were believed to be thousands of early martyrs. For the Church, this was a spiritual jackpot. Here was a seemingly endless supply of authentic first-generation Christian relics, just waiting to be distributed. A new trade began, but this time it was highly regulated. Skeletons were carefully exhumed, given names of obscure martyrs, and sent out across Catholic Europe, especially to Germany and Switzerland, to re-sanctify the churches that had been stripped by the Protestants. These catacomb saints, as they were called, were often dressed in lavish silks and jewels, laid out in glass coffins, a spectacular and slightly macabre statement of defiance against the stark simplicity of the Reformation. They were a visible, tangible link back to the heroic age of the martyrs, a testament to the endurance of the Catholic faith. So for a while, the world was divided. In the Protestant north, the old relics were gone, the shrines dismantled, and the very idea of them was viewed with suspicion and scorn. In the Catholic south, the cult of relics was revived, reformed, and given a new dramatic energy. The battle lines were drawn, but another force was gathering, a new way of thinking that would challenge not just the Protestant or Catholic view of relics, but the very foundation of belief upon which both stood. This new force was the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. If the Reformation's driving question was, is this the correct way to worship God? The Enlightenment's question was, is it reasonable to believe in this at all? A new kind of skepticism, born in the philosopher's study and fueled by the scientific revolution, began to permeate European thought. Figures like Voltaire in France didn't just mock the obvious fakes, they mocked the entire concept. Voltaire and his fellow philosophers wielded wit and reason like scalpels. They looked at the stories of the saints, the tales of miraculous healings, and the veneration of bones, and they saw not piety but superstition. They saw the relics as tools used by a cynical church to keep the population ignorant and docile. Their critique was devastatingly effective because it shifted the terms of the debate. It was no longer about theological interpretation. It was about evidence. What is the proof? What is the rational explanation for this? The idea of a miracle, the very basis of a relic's power, came under sustained attack as something contrary to the newly discovered, immutable laws of nature. The polite skepticism of the Enlightenment salons found its most violent expression in the French Revolution. If the Protestant iconoclasm was driven by religious zeal, the French Revolution's version was fueled by a radical, anti-clerical, and political ideology. The revolutionaries saw the church as part of the old regime, an institution of wealth and privilege that had to be torn down, and so a new wave of destruction was unleashed. The great royal necropolis at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, just outside Paris, was systematically desecrated. The tombs of the kings and queens of France were pried open, their remains dumped into a mass grave. The church's treasures were seized by the state. The magnificent reliquary of Saint Genevieve, the patron saint of Paris, a masterpiece of medieval goldsmithing, was dragged to a public square and melted down. The saint's remains were publicly burned. This wasn't just about cleansing a church, it was about erasing a past. It was a conscious attempt to de-Christianize France, to replace the age of faith with a new age of reason. The gold from 1,000 reliquaries was melted into coin to pay for armies, a starkly literal transformation of sacred value into secular power. By the time the dust settled in the 19th century, the world had changed irrevocably. The Industrial Revolution was chugging along, science was the new authority, and for many educated people, the cult of relics seemed like a quaint, if slightly bizarre, relic itself, a throwback to a superstitious and unenlightened age. The great unifying web of devotion had been torn apart, first by theological schism, and then by secular philosophy. And yet, it didn't completely disappear. The story doesn't end there. It just gets quieter, more fragmented. In the Catholic and Orthodox worlds, the veneration of relics continues to this day. A steady, unbroken stream of devotion. Pilgrims still flock to Santiago de Compostela, to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, to the Basilica of St. Anthony in Padua, when the relics of a popular modern saint, like Saint Thérèse of Lisieux or Padre Pio, go on tour. They draw enormous crowds of the faithful, who wait for hours to pray before a small fragment of bone or a blood-stained glove. For these believers, the object is not a historical artifact. It is a living point of connection to the holy, a conduit for grace, just as it was 1,000 years ago. The logic of faith endures, operating on a different plane from the logic of science. And what of the relics themselves? The millions of objects that survived the purges and the revolutions? They have entered a strange and fascinating afterlife. Many, of course, remain in their churches, still performing their sacred function, but many others have undergone a final, strange transformation. They have become museum pieces. You can walk into the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, or the Victoria and Albert in London, or the Louvre in Paris, and there, behind climate-controlled glass, under carefully calibrated lighting, you will see them. A reliquary casket from 12th century Limoges, its brilliant enamel still gleaming. An intricate Gothic monstrance designed to hold a sacred host, now empty. A phylactery of gold and rock crystal that once held a fragment of a saint, its label now politely explaining its art historical significance, its provenance, and the materials from which it was made. The object's job has completely changed. Its function is no longer to heal the sick, but to educate the curious. Its power is not miraculous but historical. We admire it for its craftsmanship, for what it tells us about medieval metallurgy or devotional practices. It has been stripped of its sacred aura and given a new secular one, that of the priceless artifact. It has moved from the altar to the vitrine, from an object of veneration to an object of observation. And in a final, ironic twist, the tools of the Enlightenment, science and reason are now being used to study these objects with an intensity their original owners could never have imagined. We now have the ability to subject these ancient claims to modern forensic scrutiny. Carbon-14 dating can tell us the age of a piece of wood or cloth, sometimes with devastating results for a long-held tradition. The Shroud of Turin, perhaps the most famous and controversial relic in the world, has been examined by particle physicists, textile experts and pollen analysts, all trying to unravel its mystery. The bones in a reliquary can be subjected to DNA analysis to determine their age, sex and region of origin. We can perform a CT scan on a sealed casket to see what's inside, without breaking the ancient seals. This creates a fascinating, and sometimes uncomfortable, intersection of two entirely different ways of knowing. Science seeks empirical proof, repeatable results, and logical certainty. Faith operates on trust, tradition, and personal experience. And yet here they are, in the 21st century, circling each other around a 1,000-year-old fragment of bone. Sometimes science confirms a tradition, lending it a new kind of legitimacy. More often, it complicates it, suggesting a different timeline, a different story. But for the true believer, the scientific data is often irrelevant. The faith is not in the carbon date, it is in the story and the sacred power the object represents. And so the journey ends here, in the quiet, climate-controlled hush of the present. The great, booming, chaotic and utterly central trade of the Middle Ages has faded into a murmur. The objects that once commanded the devotion of millions, that launched pilgrimages and wars, that defined the spiritual landscape of a civilization, now live on in these three distinct realms. They remain as powerful objects of faith for a smaller but still significant portion of the world. They sit silently in museums, testaments to the artistry and beliefs of a distant past, and they lie on laboratory tables, offering up their secrets to the patient gaze of science. From a sliver of wood in a dusty catacomb to a symbol of divine power, from a target of reformist rage to a subject of Enlightenment scorn, and finally to an artifact under glass. It is an extraordinary trajectory. It tells a story not just about bones and splinters, but about the evolution of belief itself, about how we see the world, and how we locate the sacred within it. The shuffling footfalls of the pilgrims on that dusty road have long since faded. The sound that remains is the gentle, almost silent hum of a museum's ventilation system, dutifully preserving the objects and the profound silence that they left behind. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can hear it too, that quiet hum, the sound of history resting at last.